This is a throwaway recording. I'm just trying to remember something that I just thought of. Was it the culture and cowardice? The cowardice of conservatives. The cowardice of conservatives. The mob aspect. What is it? No, it was inside the ideology. It was the kinds of dishonest levers that they use and the myriad faces that they use to accomplish their objectives. Because there really is a kind of murky thing. Was it a contrast between histrionic and borderline in terms of how it's this weird hybrid? How it had something to do, I was thinking about how the example that I give of battered women that are in fact borderline and that they have essentially imposed and inculcated in their victim or their host, the male abuser, they've inculcated in that male abuser a kind of histrionic leverage system that forces them to take on this kind of histrionic interface with reality, and they have sort of conditioned that victim, that host, to become a sort of a codependent thing. And then because the borderline is not consistent in their own codependency that they've inculcated, then there's like a betrayal there, and then that's usually the sort of the threat of abuse in some sense, because the borderline is not even consistent within their own sort of secondary manipulative thing, whereas histrionics do try to keep consistent. Histrionics do sort of sustain a consistent container, but it's a larger social container. In some sense, it's still hollow. It still doesn't have like proper. It's not properly substantiated, but that is sort of like diluted into the mix. That's offset into the vague, general sort of thing. So what was I thinking? It was something to do with culture itself, or something to do with borderlines, or no, it was something to do with how they argue dishonestly and how to identify what they are doing that is dishonest, how to label it so it's easier for people to track how fraudulent it is a way of saying that what they are doing is making themselves the chair of the narrative, making themselves the spokesperson of the narrative, that they are the herald of the narrative. And the kind of the inconsistency in that, kind of the general paradox in post-structuralism, where it sort of undermines itself, as all forms of incomplete nihilism always do, because they don't confront their own thing that they supposedly are reacting to. So they're sort of in this perpetual reaction which they're projecting and such. But okay, so now it was a more refined idea than what I just said, because what I've said a few times in the other recordings as well. Like, what makes it dishonest is that something about how they are accomplishing that, how they are assuming to be the spokesperson for the narrative. Or how, even if they want to say, no, this is just the narrative of the people that I represent, or a narrative that I'm allowed to use as canonical, and on the basis of it I'm allowed to essentially semantically derange anyone, and I can pervert the Constitution, and I can reinterpret reality just to fit this weird sort of fudged bandwagon of confected reality. So okay, no, I'm thinking around this too much now. I had a very clear idea as to how essentially you can just show the mark of their dishonesty, because essentially it always equates to the same overarching pattern. So what was that pattern? What was the method of deploying the pattern? I mean, anyway, the method of actually of getting this stuff to land in some sense is by calling them out and sticking with your criticism and not dropping it and continually proving it in essence. That's because then you've got a baseline essentially. You're creating a baseline upon which to sort of track their behavior, because that's the hardest thing, is that they can sort of talk themselves out of their own pitfall in some sense. They keep on reframing reality at such a high rate in order to keep the narrative going along and chugging along. And because it's sort of its adherents basically believe that they only believe in the canonical stereotype. They only believe, so they just automatically have a confirmation bias in terms of how they interpret reality, and even how they will accept certain things as being epistemically conducive, and other things that must be not regarded as epistemically conducive. And that, there's a kind of, on a meta level, there's a dishonesty and a cherry-picked, sort of idea of like what sources of data are even possible, and in some sense, they never actually care about, the solutions. They never care about actually comparing the solutions. That's not important, because to them, the moral principle of their essentially what it reduces down to is racial essentialism, is more important. That premise of categorizing people and generalizing people is too ethically expedient for them not to use it, even as it completely destroys and corrupts even how to see reality, because you can only then see reality as a racialist, and that's what they are. They are ironically racialists and racists. That's the definition of a racist, is a racialist. And they are racialists. And all this stuff has been convoluted by their various tactics of dishonesty. There was a common thread that essentially there's a way that I found a way of describing it as a positive thing that they're doing. Because you see, that's the thing, is that they can always dance around the head of a pin and say that what they're doing, they can redefine what they're doing a million different ways, because they can say, oh, well, I'm liberating, because essentially it's all pegged to why they're doing it, which means that they can just unload their narrative. They can just completely, just put their narrative on the loudspeaker every time they're asked why. The way to get to sort of debunk them is to bog them down in examining how their solutions are fraudulent, and how even any of their thinking, if applied, is just disastrous, and how it has been disastrous, and how it continues to be disastrous, and how anything that they propose doesn't even work conceptually, that it's corrupt, it's corrupt garbage. It's the window dressing of a totalitarian state. But in the same way that I mean, the Nazis had huge respect for the law, because they could make it say whatever they wanted it to, and they could reinterpret things however they wanted it to. I'm so far off. What was my clear idea? I had this very clear idea about how something to do about the chaos. Yeah, that in some sense you can miniaturize everything that they do in a kind of very simplistic sort of. If you just tell a very simplistic, you can replicate their whole version of politics by just depicting it as a very simple story. That it's like there's such a hysterical state of emergency that the only way to sort of solve the chaos of that problem is to give someone the power to generalize and stereotype about the problem so that they can supposedly be more effective in bringing it to a close and solving the problem. And so that gives them the excuse to deploy their chaos, essentially projectively, by saying that anyone who disagrees with them is a kind of is a chaos merchant that is trying to steal the simplified solution that they are peddling. And so that the identity politics person is peddling. So essentially, any disruption to the simplified, sort of shortcut is derided and criticized as being a kind of a racial conspiracy, or yet more of the oppression in another form, or it just plugs back into the narrative. So it's like the totalitarianism can never be derailed. The political accountability can never come into the political arena, because the only accountability that exists is the accountability to the racial assumptions, to the ethical corruption that's at the core of essentially the story, which is only justified because, it's such a great emergency that we have to be so hysterically anxious about solving it that we can't even think, we can't trust anyone who looks different to us. We can't think about things. Everything must just be simplified by if your ideas have the wrong color, and if you have the wrong color, then you're not allowed to speak them. That we know that we're in the pits of hell when ideas themselves and thinking itself has been infected by this racialist semantic sort of heuristic. So I actually had, because right now what I just said was not my original thought, sadly. I haven't been able to still think of it, but it was something like that. It was sort of to condense their activity as a nice summary, as a nice summarized mechanism that they keep on trying to do the same formula. It was a way to characterize their formulaic, so a way of just very quickly depicting their formulaic method of politics, and then once you've got that in simplified language, then it's very, very easy to go on to essentially explain how everything that they do is just a function of that formula, and then you've got essentially an argument against that formula itself. And that can also be deployed in shorter, sharper exchanges. Because essentially you can lay it out once, and then you can keep on referring to how you laid it out before, and then you don't have to repeat the whole long-winded thing again. In some sense, you can just keep on calling back to it by just referring to it in a summarized fashion. You can make quips about it after you've laid it out. So you just need to lay it out at least once or every now and again, and then you can just continue to make quips, and then essentially that is how you get the confrontation across politically. That is how you mount the political offensive against it. In some sense, that's how you disrobe it and you reveal it for its corruption. That's how you make inroads into convincing people. Is that you essentially you're creating a counter polemic to their oversimplified narrative of reality. And you're showing them up to be the corrupt forces that they are, and how they are destroying the functioning of how they destabilize and how they remove political accountability with this secondary, diversionary form of corrupt politics, because it's based on moral corruption as well. I mean, those are mechanics as well, but in some sense, when I say quips and things like that, I mean things that are because I haven't just done it, I haven't given any prime example. I've outlined how you would debunk them, but I haven't given the actual thing. So how, after you laid it out at some point, after you communicated, what it is that they're doing and that you know what it is that they're doing, then the way that you prove that is like when they do something representative of that. Obviously, it's not going to obviously be representative of that, so you have to sort of make it a connection to how it is the same, but it's been disguised. Then the quip is about how they are disguising it. The quip is about, oh, so now so look, it conforms to the formula, and well, that is what the quip infers and implies that they've just made new rhetoric that conforms to the formula. Um, and then once you try to get under their skin like that, then they will probably try to play the moral authoritarian against you, and they will try to shame you, and they'll try to leverage collective shame. And then you can just say things like, well, collective shame has got nothing to do with solving anyone's problem and developing this country and bringing anyone out of disadvantage. And in fact, your kind of politics is actually causing people to is causing the situation to be worse. And just because you can make some people's lives worse in a faster way doesn't mean that you are promoting justice. It actually just means that you are the kind of parasitic totalitarian fascist that can profit off leveraging great narratives that you pretend to be championing while you give the same tractor to multiple farms. How many of the same tractor can you give out? Because you're allowed to be deceptive and lie as long as it's for the cause of your identity. Well, it's the cause of the identity itself that makes it so that we have such a corrupt state that will never be able to ever be responsible, politically responsible. Okay, that sort of, yeah, I mean, these are the kinds of outlines, I'm doing it very abstractly, so it's not great, but man, I actually had what it was, though. I actually had what the formulation, a good depiction of what the formulation was. And now, maybe it'll come to me again. Anyway. Okay, I'm going to attach this recording onto the last recording, which even starts off me saying that this is a throwaway recording, but I'm going to include it because it kind of follows on, and this is, I think, quite a useful sort of thing to understand the basic mechanics at the beginning of borderline and also histrionic, although it's unconscious in histrionic. And this is a consistent theme to some degree. You can see elements of this within the cognitive dissonance that people have within their personality style. In some sense, they have a kernel of this, and or this is how their immaturity continues to manifest within themselves, or something like that. But anyway, basically, this is along. Anyway, I'm going to ground this all semantically into greed. That essentially it is greed. That is what you're dealing with when you're dealing with someone who's immature in some sense. It is the cognitive dissonance of that immaturity is because of their greed, and that greed in some sense is over the self-portrait, the self-image, the identity, as it were. How the identity is sort of is indulgent in its own trappings in some sense, in its own sophisticated form of self-entrenchment. Okay, so I'm just going to read now this thing that I wrote because I think it says it better than what I'm going to probably say talking over it. But that essentially what's happened in the inner child, in the unconscious side of the mind, which is not that unconscious for borderlines, but anyway, it is for histrionics, that there's essentially a sacrifice within the overarching psychological structure. And this also, what I'm about to say, is completely pertinent to identity politics. So the sacrifice within the overarching psychological structure to the imposition of unilaterally defined boundaries. So that means that how the belief structure in the inner child is being curated is not being curated in a transparent way, in a way that you're trying to make it coherent and consistent. You're not even trying to do that. You're just trying to impose unilaterally defined boundaries. You've got a subconscious that is relying essentially on you being able to gainsay unilaterally defined beliefs and boundaries and things like that. So you've got a kind of a belief matrix which lets you kind of get a leg, uh, uh, get in ahead of everyone else. That you kind of get a sort of a first subjective screening of sort of reducing the belief matrix in some sense, and then you kind of guard that privately in some sense. That's a bit metaphorical, but anyway, I get into these mechanics better. Okay, so the sacrifice that is occurring within the overarching psychological structure, in the case of the imposition of unilaterally defined boundaries, facilitates a unilateral greed. So essentially, unilaterally defined boundaries, I think, on a summarized aggregated sense, that is what that is what it correlates to. It correlates to facilitating a unilateral greed. That's actually what it is on the level of the inner child. That is the core premise of the borderline and the unconscious machination at the core of the histrionic. A wish to have the personage enraptured in an unassailable prestige and an incumbent high status. So you have to understand that essentially these people have created a belief about their self-portrait. They've created a belief about their self-image. And their belief is that I want to make this belief true, and this belief is like a sentence, it's like a statement, it's like a postulate. It's like, okay, my self-image is defined as having high status. My self-image or personage or whatever, my identity is defined as just being great automatically. I'm just going to give it to myself. I'm just going to give it to my vehicle in this world in some sense. And so they want to play dress up. Their inner child wants to play dress up. And so their whole beliefs are in disarray because of this central belief. So they've made up this belief, which is a bit messed up because it's dependent on external factors. It's dependent on external, let's say, emotions, because emotions are the bridge between your interface between you and the outside world in some sense. So you have an internal belief that is somewhat invested completely in the external experience to some degree. And so, and then that bridge has to be facilitated by a whole sophisticated interchange of how you project that belief into reality in some sense, and how you have to misread reality to make it fit. So facilitates a unilateral greed that is the core premise of the borderline and the unconscious machination at the core of the histrionic. A wish to have the personage enraptured in an unassailable prestige and an incumbent high status. So the greed is that they are greedy for this high status. They are greedy for this positive affirmation, which they believe to just possess. It's not a qualified belief. They want that to be true, and they are willing to sacrifice the rest of their beliefs in order to make it true about their self-portrait or their self-image. So that's the core greed, which is the overriding character of belief that has come to essentially infect their ego or their false ego complex, or it's one of the threads within their false ego complex. It's one of the main supporting pillars in their false ego complex. So it might not be the prime one. The prime one might be something else that's based on trauma, but this is one of the compensating elements. Okay, so, and this greed can also be repackaged and leveraged as a system of intellectual sympathizing. So this greed can manifest in a surrogate form of essentially a narrative about the world, about categories of the world. You can make a whole sympathetic set of knowledge that props up this internal greed in some sense, which then essentially becomes unconscious to the extent to which that it is supplemented by a surrogate intellectual sympathizing, which is why borderlines look very awkward, because if their intellectual gambit doesn't work, then they'll just collapse it, blow it up, and try another one. They'll just shift between them, and then they look very contrived, and the whole thing looks quite fraudulent, and the manipulation becomes very ostensible. But essentially, the greed is what drives them in some sense, and the borderlines are actually more immediately aware of that unconscious greed that is unconscious in the histrionic, but it's not unconscious in the borderline. The borderline feels the pressure of that greed. They are, in some sense, they have this ideal. The greed is represented to them by an ideal self-image, by a belief in how they see themselves. And they're not willing to see themselves any other way. They're not willing to let go and release themselves from their own trap in some sense. Also because it's so easy to counterfeit this greed as what I'm about to explain now. So, it can be concealed or deployed through the intellectual sympathizing game of having a web of reality that is commensurate with this greed, because it's been dispersed into this web of how the system works, how the world works, general claims, narrative claims of framing how things or why things exist. Usually it's problematic because it can't contend why and how simultaneously. It can only contend why, and it usually throws how under the bus, or it's very narrow in its depiction of how things occur. It's cherry picked in terms of whenever it's describing how something happens, it's always the most fudged, impossible kind of thinking. It's so obviously dishonest. It's so functionally pathological. It's like the rantings of a racialist. It's like the rantings of any racist or Nazi, or about their conspiracy theories. It's exactly what these SJWs are on about whenever they rant about their narrative, because this is how they see the world, and they can't see it any other way, because otherwise they sacrifice this canonical, in some sense, the why and the how become a confected, sort of mixed up thing, and the scientism pseudo-intellectuals have the same kind of thing. They convolute it in just the same kind of way, in just a completely different set of subject matter. Anyway, so this greed and intellectual sympathizing, which the one is kind of the surrogate of the other, or the one sort of gets hidden and concealed within the other. The intellectual sympathizing is a more sophisticated sort of system, because it is essentially hiding yourself in the culture itself, in the environment, in the psychic environment, within the subconscious milieu and emotional. So you've got some theory about emotions generally, or integrity, and how integrity and anyway, it can be cast in many different forms in some sense. But anyway, there is another aspect of this which the borderline has, which in some sense is, I always relate it to the glasshouse defense, which is that they use it as envy. They give up the naked greed in some sense, like the histrionics are doing greed and intellectual sympathizing and intellectual sympathy, in a web of intellectual sympathy. That's what the histrionics are doing. For their greed. What borderlines are doing is they are actually repackaging their greed as envy. And because envy is a private thing, it's a dark thing, it's something that you're not proud about, but maybe you do feel envy, and a lot of the social justice people, especially the borderline types, if you talk to them on a deep level, they will even quite nakedly, in some sense, depict their envy. They wear their envy as their it's this weird kind of it's actually that kind of borderline invasiveness. Like, let me share my envy with you, so then you can be a part of making the fantasy reality in some sense. Like, let me be vulnerable and show you my envy, and then it's the world's job to sort of make it up to me in some sense. So the envy is usually also deployed and disguised as sadistically edged accusations, which demand a kind of sympathized sabotage, that everyone else must sabotage themselves in order to sort of make good on this envy which is felt. So the envy is deployed as a kind of emotional vector of
codependency, basically, and all those sorts of themes. And you can see politically how this also works within fascist cultures and societies, and fascist ideology, which identity politics is clearly part of that. So the thing is that then the envy is very, very sharp and dangerous, because the envy can somewhat be direct, but also demand a certain compliance of subterfuge. It gets away with a level of subterfuge, so it can be deep and penetrating, but then it can also be at its own discretion, it can blunt things, it can divert things, because envy is a you can't be honest about envy. I'm not describing this that well, but let me just read my note because it comes out clearer. Okay, so, and this greed can also be repackaged and leveraged as a system of intellectual sympathizing, or as a sort of envy disguised as sadistically edged accusations which demand a sympathized sabotage. All the while, this envy is never revealed directly, it must remain hidden to save its own face, while at the same time transferring the stress from its concealment into an entrenched narrative that must remain intact, acting as the sacred cow to sustain the ongoing internal misdirection. So, as the greed is being essentially deployed as an envy relationship to the exterior environment, so essentially what borderlines are doing is they are reaching out on the level of, like, okay, they have translated their own greed into envy, because everyone can be imagined to exert some aspect of envy. Envy is like the Matrix, essentially, like in the Matrix movies. That is envy. Okay, so everyone gets incepted into the Matrix, and you can imagine that, there is only the Matrix. Okay, I don't want to go into that metaphor. But in the logic of that would be that there is no escaping from the matrix, that everyone has their own matrix in some sense, but there is this fundamental belief that there is only one way to make a matrix, and all matrices are made out of envy. They have that kind of sort of, they've already bought into all those premises, and essentially that's because envy is their vector of getting their greed, in essence, that they have decided to only relate to the world through envy, and they don't have another valence to do it through. They don't have another conduit. They don't have another connection to their subconscious. And so, because envy is their root of how their inner child relates to their subconscious, they can have this ideological filtration, essentially, or any kind, essentially they can control things. They can put one-way glass up there. You can even, I saw Slavoj Žižek was giving a lecture to someone when he said slightly better, when he was less now, in my view, he's less confrontational against these people. He tries to agree with them half the time, and then he tries to sort of say something to sort of undermine their paradigm, but he doesn't, he's not as forthright as I would like it. But anyway, he was giving a lecture a while ago. This is quite an old lecture, to a class, and the left-leaning person who was like letting him lecture to his class said, gave this preamble. It was so disgusting. It was like, remember, when people are saying things, remember to switch on your missiles to shoot down the things that they say that, like, don't meet this filter. That's the kind of sort of that would be the ideological version of the borderline envy, in terms of how they have this very sophisticated way of having this one-way flow of coercion and this one-way flow of control in relation to their subconscious experience, which in some sense that filtration system is capable of completely imploding the subconscious and resetting it, and wishing and wanting to push the reset button, while everyone else has to stay in their sort of, in their conceptualized form that has been mapped by their envy. So their envy has a kind of is the architect over the matrix, is a unilateral architect, which is, that's meant to correlate with how I started off my this piece of writing when I say that unilaterally defined boundaries facilitates the unilateral greed. So essentially the envy then is therefore allowed to be shy about itself. It's allowed to be embarrassed about itself, that it has this private subjugation of reality, that it has this unilaterally defined thing, and usually when that's described, it's described in, very weird kind of esoteric nonsense, like, oh, everyone has their feeling, everyone has their lived experience, everyone has their truth, it's this blather that just goes on and on and on, that doesn't really ever ground itself, it doesn't really have an understanding, and you realize that they don't even have clear, they don't even use the same words consistently, like truth has multiple different meanings, and then essentially how they deploy their bullshit ideologically is they equivocate between those words. They use the fallacy of equivocation is what essentially they use to perpetrate their manipulation. All the manipulation in identity politics is generally the fallacy of equivocation. Other than the prime sort of fallacy that they sort of use, which is essentially that this envy itself has a right to a kind of latent authority, that in some sense it's a general appeal to authority, which is usually justified by this rational alignment of facts and rationality itself that excuses its deployment. And although even the rationality might not be finished in, let's say, digesting the world and digesting everything and aligning everything in relation to it, it's in the process of doing that. So that's good enough for them. That's their fascist project. That's their 1,000-year Reich. That's how fascists have to sort of orientate themselves epistemologically, in some sense. It's a project that's in the making, and that's good enough for them. And so that's how they get away with their bandwagon. Okay, let me center myself back here. So all the while, this envy is never revealed directly. It must remain hidden to save its own face, while at the same time transferring the stress from its concealment into an entrenched narrative that must remain intact, acting as the sacred cow to sustain the ongoing internal misdirection. So obviously the thing is that you could say, just stop being greedy and you'll stop needing this unilateral bullshit that you keep on casting everyone into the narrative thereof. But instead, they will say, I'm not being greedy. I just have some secret envy, which they won't even admit to that. And then they'll say, but everyone has the same secret envy and you can't not have it. And we must all be forgiven for the secret envy, and it must remain private. And because that's how everyone acts in the world anyway. Right. So it's the envy politics, essentially. It's the politics of envy. And once they've got everyone plugged into that matrix, they can have at it. That's how they essentially continually promulgate their bullshit. And that's a game that never has to end. In some sense, you can't necessarily save someone from that. If they want to play that game in their mind, you can't stop them. And in some sense, they will always just essentially be poisonous and toxic to that extent, that they'll be trying to play that game, and it's being exposed to it, frankly, is very poisonous. It's just, it's poisonous to the soul, because in some sense they will just constantly make you repeat yourself. They will constantly sap your lifeblood. They will constantly it's attrition, essentially. It's a game of disorientation and decompartmentalization. They will abuse your subconscious until you concede to them their envy dynamic and their envy input, essentially. And if you have prolonged exposure, you can't help but start to realize what you're sort of dealing with. And once you realize what you're dealing with, then, the kind of compromise becomes more, the compromise of the continued sort of exposure becomes more deeply problematic, let's just say, for the victim, for the host, for the people that sort of have to tolerate it to some degree. It gets much more depraved. The whole situation, and essentially, these people, they care more about controlling people through their envy than they care about anything else. They don't care if the world burns. They don't care if what they say doesn't match up with reality. They don't care how much collateral damage there is. Controlling people through the envy is the utmost value in some sense, because that validates the whole thing, and that also validates the rational alignment. So the whole pseudo-intellectualism as the secondary economy in some sense is subterfuge. In some sense, I think rationality rules, is him being histrionic and doing a lot of this unconsciously. You know, the kind of debates that he gets into, the kind of argumentation that he gets into, is all symbolic or emblematic of you know, these people are essentially greedy little vampires, and they have to get their fix. They have to subjugate and control, to prove, to vindicate the. Because when I say greed, I mean, you know, I'm saying it's a very esoteric form of greed. It's the greed of wanting a good character by without qualification, like wanting to have a gold character, wanting to be precious, wanting to have prestige, high status, just by sort of promising yourself and committing to yourself that it's already yours, in some sense. You know, not by curating a system of coherent beliefs that are curated and updated and vulnerable to revision. They don't want that. To them, they have to live in the atrophied, frozen form instead, because they just want to give it to themselves already. They just want it already. So that's the kind of greed I'm talking about. It's almost like a spiritual greed in some sense. Anyway, okay, so they're transferring the stress from the concealment of that greed, which is much easier to conceal in terms of envy, because envy in some sense can be justified as saying, well, everyone has it, or something like that. Everyone else has it, some form of it already, and I even have less of it. So it's like the kind of self-sympathizing, self-referencing excuse fabrication. So, you know, like greed and envy in some sense are very similar. But anyway, yeah, a lot of what I'm saying might need to be neatened up on a technical level. But anyway, okay, so transferring the stress of the concealment of this envy, which is also a more sophisticated form of deploying the greed, into an entrenched narrative that must remain intact as the sacred cow to sustain the ongoing internal misdirection of transferring this greed into the envy. So there is a sort of self delusion there on some level, even in terms of the borderline. There's a low level self delusion, but it's all pretty dark as far as I can see. In that it's still, you know, essentially you want to tell yourself that you're not greedy, but you tell yourself that you're envious. You know, to me, it's like I think that you could still have the kind of capacity to realize that envy is just as toxic as greed in some sense, but they might not be that unconscious at trying to translate their greed into envy, because envy, at least in some sense, can be more rationally justifiable, because you can imagine that everyone else already acts on their envy. You can just project that onto people. Whether it's true or not, you can make it true by interpretation. So in some sense, envy is the inverse vector of greed, essentially, of socializing your greed in some sense. The constant doubling down in order to derange any challenge that might dislodge the concealed envy. Because the embarrassing envy is just a sophisticated deployment of greed. Okay, yeah, so I've now just sort of repeated myself. Yeah, so that's basically the idea. I probably could have said that in a more simplified way, but I think that I've got all the structures out there. Hopefully some other people will give this some thought, and because I must say it's much easier for me to talk about this stuff when I'm discussing it with someone, because then um, I'm not sort of simulating a conversation in my head, and so usually, generally myself, I have the tendency to generalize and abstract and to make universal principles, which are hard to relate when there isn't another person that's actually contending their own ideas for me to ground it into explanation. Um, so yeah, I'm aware that I'm not that good at explaining things because it gets more and more dry and technical, um, or it just gets very abstract. I mean, I think it is. I am good at explaining things in an abstract way, but that is not a very good way of most people for understanding things. But anyway, yeah. So I think this is an important sort of thing to lay down. So I will add this to this current lot of recordings.